I had arrived in that forgotten corner of Texas, armed with my recorder, notepad, and a healthy dose of skepticism. I was determined to debunk the absurd tales of a blood-sucking beast prowling the borderlands. The Chupacabra, some laughable creature that surely existed only in the fevered minds of locals who had too much time and too little imagination. It seemed like a classic case of folklore run wild. The first night, I drove out to the edge of town to meet one of the farmers who had reported missing livestock. His ranch lay sprawled beneath a low, brooding sky, the kind that pressed down on you and made the world feel small. He was waiting for me by the fence, a weathered man with lines etched into his face that spoke of hard days and sleepless nights. He looked at me with wary eyes, as if he already knew I wouldn't believe him. "Lost 3 goats last night," he said, not bothering with a greeting. "Found them drained of blood, just like the others." I followed him out to the pen, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. The ground was stained, a sickly red-brown against the parched earth. The bodies of the goats lay strewn across the ground, throats torn open with brutal precision. I knelt down, studying the wounds. No animal I knew could do this. "You see?" he muttered, his voice a rough whisper. "It's not a coyote or a bobcat. Those critters take what they kill. But this thing, it leaves them behind, sucks them dry and leaves them to rot." The farmer shifted uneasily, glancing over his shoulder. "You're not from around here, so maybe you don't understand. Folks around these parts, we don't go out after dark. Not anymore." I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something lurked just beyond the reach of our lights, hidden in the shadows that clung to the trees like cobwebs. But I was here for answers, and I wasn't about to let some local superstition get under my skin. "Can you show me where it happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The farmer hesitated, then nodded. He led me through the tangled underbrush, past gnarled trees that seemed to twist and contort in the faint glow of the flashlight. My heart raced as we walked, the air thick with an unnatural silence. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing but the sound of our boots crunching against the dirt. We reached a clearing, and that's when I saw it. Claw marks, deep and jagged, carved into the ground as if something massive had dragged itself across the earth. I crouched down, running my fingers over the grooves. Whatever had made them was big, far bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. I stood up, my gaze drifting toward the tree line. I felt it then, a prickling at the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, my flashlight sweeping across the shadows. And then I saw them. 2 eyes, glinting red in the darkness, staring back at me from between the trees. A chill washed over me, and I took a step back, my heart pounding. The farmer grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "We need to go," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "Now!" Before I could respond, a shrill, inhuman scream pierced the night. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a high-pitched wail that clawed at my eardrums and made my blood run cold. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing, and that's when I saw it. A shape moving through the shadows, its body contorted and hunched, covered in matted fur that seemed to shift and shimmer in the moonlight. It moved with an unnatural grace, slinking closer, its red eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't tear my gaze away, caught in the creature's stare, paralyzed by a fear that rooted me to the spot. The farmer pulled me back, yanking me out of my trance, and together we ran, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of snapping branches and pounding footsteps echoing in my ears. I didn't look back, but I could feel it behind us, closing in, a dark shadow that moved with terrifying speed. We reached the truck, and I scrambled inside, slamming the door just as the creature let out another bone-chilling scream. The farmer floored the gas, and we tore down the dirt road, the headlights cutting through the darkness as we sped away. I glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the empty road stretching behind us, swallowed by the night. But I knew it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe I was in over my head. Because this wasn't just a myth, wasn't just a story. The Chupacabra was real, and whatever it wasn't done with me yet. The ride back to town was a blur, my mind racing with images of those piercing red eyes and the blood-chilling scream that had reverberated through the night. My skepticism was shattered, replaced by a cold, creeping dread that settled in my bones. This was more than just an assignment. It felt like a warning, a message that I'd stumbled into something far beyond my understanding. When we reached the safety of the farmer's house, I bolted out of the truck and leaned against the side, gasping for air. The farmer stood silently beside me, his face drawn and pale, his eyes clouded with fear and something else, an understanding I didn't yet share. "Whatever you saw," he began, his voice barely a murmur, "it wasn't the Chupacabra, at least not the one we talk about around here. This was different, older." I tried to process his words, but my mind was spinning. "Older?" I managed to ask, my voice shaky. The farmer nodded, his gaze distant. "The old folks, they talk about a shadow, a thing that's been here long before us, long before anyone. It's tied to the land, drawn to blood and fear. The Chupacabra might be just a name we gave it, but it's something more than that. Something that feeds on our nightmares." I stared at him, barely able to breathe. I wanted to laugh, to shake my head and tell him he was crazy. But after what I'd seen, I wasn't so sure anymore. We went inside, and he poured us both a stiff drink. I took a long swallow, the burn of the liquor grounding me, giving me something solid to hold on to. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of what we'd witnessed pressing down on us like a heavy shroud. Finally, I broke the silence. "What happens next?" I asked, more to myself than to him. The farmer met my gaze, his eyes cold and hard. "You leave. You get out of here before it decides to come back for you. It doesn't like strangers. I can feel it. It's watching you." But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I'd come here for answers, and I wasn't about to turn back without understanding what was really happening. The fear that had gripped me in the forest was still there, but now it was mingled with something else, a desperate need to know the truth. "I need to see it again," I said, the words surprising even me. "I need to know what it is." The farmer shook his head, his face twisted with anger and fear. "You don't know what you're asking for. You think you're here for a story, but it's more than that. It's got a way of getting inside your head, making you see things. It'll tear you apart piece by piece until there's nothing left but the shadow of who you were." Despite his warnings, I was determined. I spent the next few days interviewing locals, piecing together fragments of stories and legends that all seemed to point to the same thing. A presence lurking in the woods, watching from the shadows, feeding on those who strayed too close. I learned of missing people, strange animal mutilations, and eerie lights that flickered in the darkness, just beyond the tree line. One night, I convinced a group of locals to take me back to the clearing where we'd first seen the creature. They were hesitant, but after some coaxing, they agreed. We set out at dusk, armed with flashlights, a few hunting rifles, and a silent, shared sense of dread. As we made our way through the trees, the forest seemed to close in around us, the air thick with the smell of decay and something else. A metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. We reached the clearing, and for a moment everything was still. Too still. Then, out of nowhere, a chill swept over me, and I knew we weren't alone. My flashlight flickered, casting strange, twisted shadows across the ground, and that's when I saw it. Movement just at the edge of the trees. A dark shape, slinking closer, its red eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. One of the locals shouted, raising his rifle, and the creature let out a scream that split the air, raw and primal, like the sound of a soul being torn apart. The man fired, and the crack of the gunshot echoed through the forest. But when the smoke cleared, there was nothing there. Only shadows, shifting and writhing, as if they had a life of their own. We stood frozen, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. And then, out of the darkness, something lunged. I felt a searing pain across my chest as claws tore into my flesh, and I staggered back, clutching at the wound. I could feel the blood seeping through my fingers, warm and sticky, the scent of iron filling my nostrils. The others fired their rifles wildly, the flashes of gunfire illuminating the twisted shapes that seemed to close in around us. I fell to the ground, my vision blurring as I saw the creatures emerging from the shadows. They weren't just one thing. They were many, a swarm of dark shapes with eyes that glowed like embers, moving with a fluid, unnatural grace. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was alone. The clearing was empty, the forest silent. My wounds ached, and as I stumbled to my feet, I realized with a sickening dread that there was no sign of the others. No bodies, no blood, nothing. It was as if they had simply vanished into the night. But I knew they were still out there, watching, waiting. And as I turned to leave, I felt those red eyes on me once more, following my every step as I made my way back through the forest, back to the town, back to the safety of the light. I could barely make it back to town. My wounds were shallow, but the pain was a constant reminder of what had happened, or maybe what hadn't happened. The whole encounter felt surreal, like some fever dream I couldn't quite shake. I staggered into the only clinic in town, hoping they wouldn't ask too many questions. The doctor, a grizzled man with a cigarette permanently dangling from his lips, patched me up with practiced efficiency. He didn't ask about the claw marks that ran jagged across my chest, but his eyes held a knowing glint. He'd seen injuries like mine before, and he didn't need an explanation. "You've been out there, haven't you?" he muttered, his voice rough like sandpaper. "In the woods?" I nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. "We saw it," I whispered, almost afraid to say the words out loud. "We all saw it," the doctor nodded, not surprised. He finished bandaging me up and reached for a small flask in his pocket, taking a long swig before offering it to me. I took it gratefully, letting the burn of the alcohol settle my nerves. "Let me tell you something," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "The Chupacabra ain't just a creature, it's a curse. A darkness that's been here long before any of us, feeding off the land, off the people who get too curious. Most folks around here know better than to go looking for it." I wanted to ask him more, but something in his gaze warned me off. It was clear he wasn't going to say anything else. He simply shook his head as if I were already a lost cause and sent me on my way. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I tracked down everyone who'd been with me that night, but it was as if they'd been wiped from existence. I went to their homes only to find empty lots or houses filled with strangers who claimed to have lived there for years. I checked the town records, but there were no traces of them. No birth certificates, no driver's licenses, nothing. My frustration mounted as I dug deeper, asking locals and scouring newspaper archives, only to find dead ends and strange looks. People started avoiding me, sidestepping in the street, whispering behind my back. It was as if the whole town was conspiring to erase any trace of that night, and the more I pushed, the more I felt the walls closing in. Then, on the fourth night after the attack, I woke to a strange noise outside my window. It was a low, guttural growl like the sound of a predator stalking its prey. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest, as I realized it was coming from the tree line at the edge of the property. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, pooling together to form something vaguely humanoid, but misshapen, like a figure trying to mold itself into something it wasn't meant to be. I could see its eyes first, two burning coals staring straight at me, unblinking, as if it could see straight through me. The growl grew louder, echoing through the stillness of the night, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the back door, running through the deserted streets with nothing but my flashlight to guide me. I ended up at the edge of town, by an old church that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The doors hung off their hinges and the windows were broken, the interior lost to darkness. I slipped inside, hoping the thick stone walls would keep whatever it was out. But as I caught my breath, I noticed something odd. Symbols scratched into the walls, strange markings that seemed to writhe in the faint moonlight filtering through the broken glass. The markings were crude, drawn with what looked like blood, and as I traced them with my fingers, I felt a surge of nausea, a sickly, sweet smell filling my nostrils. It was then that I saw the altar at the front of the church, covered in dried animal carcasses and surrounded by candles that flickered with an unnatural blue flame. And then I heard it. A whisper, soft and seductive, calling my name. The voice was low, raspy, like the sound of dead leaves scraping across stone. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, rising and falling like the tide. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, filling my mind with images of blood and darkness, of twisted creatures lurking in the shadows, their eyes burning with an unnatural light. Suddenly, the ground beneath me began to shake, and I stumbled back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay, and I could feel something ancient and malevolent, drawing closer, pressing against the edges of reality, trying to break through. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside with whatever lurked in the shadows. I could see it now, a shifting mass of darkness that twisted and writhed, taking on shapes that defied logic. Things that shouldn't exist, things that felt like they'd crawled out of some nightmare I'd long forgotten. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I could hear it breathing, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment, savoring my fear. And then I felt it. A cold, clammy hand on my shoulder, fingers digging into my flesh, pulling me back into the shadows. I struggled, thrashing wildly, but it was no use. The darkness closed around me, swallowing me whole, and all I could do was scream. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold stone floor of the church, alone, the oppressive silence suffocating me. I had no idea how long I'd been there, but the thick, unnatural darkness had retreated, leaving behind only a thin layer of shadows clinging to the walls like a fading nightmare. I struggled to my feet, every muscle in my body aching, and reached for my flashlight. It was cracked, the lens shattered, but it flickered to life, casting a dim beam across the empty room. I moved cautiously, every step echoing through the hollow space. I needed to get out, to escape whatever twisted force had dragged me here, but my legs felt leaden, and my mind was foggy, clouded with images I couldn't quite piece together. I turned back toward the entrance, only to find the doorway blocked by a wall of shadows that seemed to pulse and breathe, alive with a malevolent energy. I took a step back, my heart racing as the shadows began to shift, pulling away to reveal a figure standing before me. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its limbs were elongated, its skin mottled and pale, stretched tight over sharp, angular bones. Its eyes were empty pits of darkness, devoid of any light, but somehow I could feel its gaze burning into me, cutting through me like a blade. I could see its mouth moving, whispering words I couldn't understand, its voice a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through my bones. The thing stepped forward, and I could smell it now, a sickly sweet odor that filled my nostrils and turned my stomach. I took another step back, my mind racing as I searched for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows pressed in from all sides, trapping me, suffocating me. I was completely alone, at the mercy of whatever this creature was. Then, suddenly it stopped, tilting its head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Its empty eyes seemed to narrow, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or a glimmer of something darker, something primal and hungry. It reached out a clawed hand, and I braced myself, expecting pain, but instead, I felt a strange, numbing cold seep into my skin, spreading through my veins like ice. I felt myself slipping, my consciousness fading, and then, as if from far away, I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, soft and clear, calling my name. The creature turned, its focus shifting, and I seized the opportunity to break free, stumbling toward the altar where I'd seen the strange symbols scrawled in blood. I didn't know what I was looking for, but instinct drove me to search, to find something, anything, that might offer a way out. My hands brushed against something cold and metallic, and I lifted it, holding it up to the dim light. It was an amulet, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. I could feel a warmth radiating from it, cutting through the chill that had settled in my bones. I clutched the amulet, pressing it to my chest, and felt a surge of energy course through me. The shadows recoiled, hissing and writhing, as if repelled by the light that emanated from the small object. I held it up, advancing toward the creature, and it shrank back, its empty eyes widening in what I could only describe as fear. The thing let out a scream, a high-pitched wail that sent a shiver down my spine. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me alone in the silence once more. I lowered the amulet, my hands shaking, and turned back toward the doorway. The wall of shadows had receded, leaving the path open. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the church, into the open air, and kept running until I reached the edge of town. I stumbled into the farmer's house, out of breath, my clothes torn and covered in dirt. He was waiting for me, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're lucky you made it out," he said quietly, his voice trembling. "Most who go looking for it don't come back." I didn't respond. I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, trying to process everything that had happened. The creature, the shadows, the amulet. It all felt like some twisted nightmare, something out of a story too horrible to be true. But I knew it was real. I could feel it in the bruises on my skin, the blood on my hands. As the farmer poured me a drink, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see those red eyes staring back at me. But there was nothing, only the empty night stretching out before me like a dark, endless void. I knew it wasn't over. The creature, the shadows, the curse, whatever it was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to let my guard down. And as I sat there, clutching the amulet, I realized that it wasn't just the creature that haunted this town. It was something far older, something that fed on fear, on pain, on the very essence of life itself. And it had marked me, Even as I sat in the safety of the farmer's house, I could feel its presence. a dark, malignant force lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, watching, waiting. I knew deep down that this was only the beginning, that whatever had come for me that night was not done with me yet. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I felt a chill settle over me, a bone-deep certainty that I was forever bound to the darkness that had claimed me. I woke up the next morning feeling strangely calm. The memories of the night before clung to me like a fog, but somehow I felt lighter, as if the weight that had been pressing down on me had finally lifted. The farmer sat across from me, watching me with a cautious expression, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You still have it, don't you?" he asked, nodding toward the amulet I clutched tightly in my hand. I nodded. The amulet's warmth pulsed gently against my palm, a comforting reminder of the light that had driven the creature back. I felt a strange sense of connection to it, as if it had become a part of me, a protective force that would stay with me no matter where I went. The farmer leaned back, letting out a long, shaky breath. "You're the first one I've seen make it through a night like that. There's power in that thing, you know. It's old magic, older than the shadows, older than the creature itself. It's said to belong to the people who lived here before us, guardians of the land." I turned the amulet over in my hand, tracing the strange symbols etched into its surface. I could feel its energy, a steady, reassuring presence that seemed to hum with life. "So what now?" I asked, looking up at the farmer. He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Now you leave! And you take that amulet with you. It's yours now, a part of you. As long as you have it, you're safe. That creature, that darkness, it can't touch you anymore. You've got the protection of something far greater than it." A sense of relief washed over me, and for the first time since I'd arrived in that town, I felt at peace. I knew there would always be shadows in the world, dark places where creatures like the one I'd faced lurked, waiting for the unwary. But I also knew that I'd been given a gift, a weapon to ward off that darkness, to keep the shadows at bay. As I packed up my things and prepared to leave, the farmer walked me to the edge of his property. We stood there for a moment, looking out at the town that lay in the distance, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. "Thank you," I said, turning to him. "For everything." He nodded, his face creased with a warm smile. "No, thank you. You reminded us that there's still hope, that no matter how deep the darkness, there's always a way back to the light." With a final wave, I climbed into my car and drove away, feeling the weight of the amulet against my chest like a reassuring heartbeat. As I left the town behind, the landscape began to change, the harsh, twisted trees giving way to open fields and clear skies. And somewhere along the road, I realized that I was smiling. I felt alive, truly alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew there would be other stories, other shadows to face, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had faced the darkness, and I had come out the other side. As I drove away, the amulet seemed to glow with a warm, gentle light, and I knew that I would never walk alone again. I had become a guardian, a protector against the darkness, carrying the light of those who had come before me, and as long as I held on to that light, I knew I would always find my way back, no matter how dark the night.